So, good morning, everyone. I want to talk this morning about vulnerability because I think it really coincides with bringing our true self to our world and sort of looking at the masks we wear. So, and this is I don't want to talk about it as a virtue that we sort of look at from a distance. I want to talk about it as really something I'd like you to experiment with this week. And, I will remind you that we were all issued emotional armor early in our lives. We didn't choose it. It was just sort of imposed on us. For me, if, for example, growing up in the South in the 1950s, the message was constant: be brave, be strong, never let them see you sweat, never let them see you cry. Don't cry, don't need, handle it, whatever it is. I recall, crying on the playground in those days, probably still for a boy with his friends around, was really kind of an emotional death sentence. I mean, you would carry the label of crybaby forever. But that's just one example. I mean, others of us were handed a different suit of armor. Um, be agreeable, be useful, don't take up space, don't be one with problems, don't ask too much of me. I mean, the list goes on and on. And the instructions varied. They weren't transmitted on a blackboard. They were just sort of implied or conveyed through nonverbal or verbal messages. But the result was the same: a set of habits that making sure we never expose sort of the tender parts of ourselves. And here's what I want to say plainly because it matters. The armor was not stupid. It was put there for a reason. It was put there to protect us. If we grew up in a household where feelings were either discouraged or dangerous, or on the schoolyard, or in a job where uncertainty got you passed over for promotion, the armor worked. It was protective. That's why we wore it. But the Dharma isn't asking us to be ashamed of it. It's asking us to pose the question to ourselves: is it still working, and in what context is it still showing up, and what is it costing us? Because if we notice what happens when we're wearing the armor, typically we're pretty closed down. Someone criticizes us and we sort of draw in, we sort of shut down. A friend says the wrong thing, we sort of become a little more distant. We're still there, but we've sort of checked out. We've sort of left. The partner asks what's wrong, and we say nothing while our jaw sort of sets. All these ways, the contraction that the armor usually creates. And this is, I don't mean this metaphorically, I mean this literally. It's something we can feel, it's something we can start to notice. And we talk about noticing. And with a little practice, we can catch it happening in real time. And the cost is that the contraction doesn't discriminate. And what I mean by that, the same wall that keeps out criticism keeps out affection, keeps out connection. The same numbness that dulls grief dulls delight. We cannot close down selectively. We cannot close down selectively. We don't get to just sort of pick and choose where we're going to close down. We're either open or we're closed. I mean, that's a gross overstatement, but I think it's generally true. If we spent 30, 40, 50 years of not being hurt often, we also find that we spent 30, 40, or 50 years of not really connecting, of not really being reached. And we don't really know consciously always when that deal got made. Okay. Now, the Buddhist word, as you know, for this engine underneath this is clinging, because what we cling to most fiercely aren't our possessions, our iPhone, our toys, our whatever. It's our self-image, the version of us that seems to have it all together, that's competent, that doesn't struggle. And I can tell you from my own life that defending that image is a full-time job. But there's no pay, there's no benefits, and there's no days off. It's a full-time job. The Buddhist teaching of anatta or non-self gets translated in sort of mystical ways, but you can take it in a very down-to-earth, pragmatic way. And that is that this self we're defending, this ego we're defending, it's not a fixed thing, as you know. It's a running story. It's constantly revised. We assemble it out of our moods, our preferences, our experiences, our memories, and other people's opinions. We are spending enormous energy protecting something that's always changing anyway. And I think when we see that clearly, when we really understand this concept of this ever changing thing we call the self, called the ego, the guarding gets less urgent. We begin to feel a little bit of breathing room there. And it's not because we've transcended anything. It's because that what we've noticed is that we're guarding a rumor, a story about ourselves. Now, I want to be precise here because this word vulnerability, has gotten really soft from overuse in our culture, I think. Vulnerability is not oversharing. It's not having no boundaries. It's not telling your whole trauma story to a stranger at work. That's not openness. That's not skillful vulnerability. That's just another kind of armor. Okay. That's just sort of proactive armor. Flooding the room with all of our stuff so no real contact can happen. That's what I mean by another type of armor. In addition, vulnerability is not tolerating mistreatment. It's not the absence of boundaries. And this matters enormously. The Buddha never said to stay in a room with someone who is harming us. He clearly said he didn't maybe perhaps use the word boundaries, but he clearly talked about this. An open heart is entirely compatible with a locked door when that locked door is necessary. Some of the most tenderhearted people, call them vulnerable people I know, have very clear boundaries. And the boundary is what makes the tenderness survivable. The boundary is what makes the vulnerability doable. Because it is not passivity. It's not resignation dressed up as acceptance. What it is the skillful choice, the skillful willingness to let something land, to let ourselves be affected by loss, by another person's pain, by our own fears, by our own self-doubts, without immediately reaching for the armor, without immediately putting the mask back on. We don't put it on. We then go ahead and act appropriately and skillfully anyway. Rilke, the German poet, wrote, quote, "Ultimately, it is on our vulnerability that we depend. Ultimately, it is on our vulnerability that we depend." And I read that when I love that quote. When I read it as a claim about how things actually work. That everything that makes a life worth having, being loved, being seen, being known, being moved emotionally, changing our mind, it requires that we're reachable in the way that Rilke alludes. There's no version where you get the connection by skipping the exposure. It just doesn't happen. If we're talking about golf scores and the headlines, yeah, we're having a nice conversation, but we're not really connecting. So where does this show up? Well, it doesn't necessarily show up during our meditation. That's kind of easy. It shows up in the hard conversations we've been postponing with those closest to us. And we all know this one. The reason we haven't had it is that it requires saying something that could result in our being rejected. That's why we wear the armor. We want to avoid the pain of that. It shows up admitting we made a mistake. Every instinct says explain things, contextualize things, outsource the blame, distribute the blame, don't own it. But the open move is, I got that wrong, and here's what I'm doing about it. I'm sorry. We just don't like to go there. The mere thought of that, we can sort of feel the heat in our faces. It shows up when we ask for help. Boy, I hate that one. I've struggled with that one. asking for help. Many of us would rather carry something until our back gives out rather than say, I can't do this alone. We'd rather kill ourselves than say, I can't do it alone. So we ask ourselves, what belief are we carrying that makes the trade seem reasonable? Okay. What belief makes the trade seem reasonable that we can adopt? It shows up sitting with someone who's grieving and being fully present. It shows up the urge to fix, to advise, to find the silver lining. It's about our discomfort when we're there. When we're sitting with someone with grief, and we want to fix it, we want to give advice, we want to find the silver lining, say it's going to be okay. That's usually our own discomfort, not the other person. Staying there, saying little, not flinching, that's the practice. It shows up in the vulnerability of saying you love someone before they say it. You know, still at any age, I would suggest to you that's one of the genuinely brave acts available to us as human beings. Okay. Here's the paradox at the center of this teaching today. The armored life feels safe, but it is exhausting. It is maintaining the story, maintaining the act. Alternately, the open life feels risky, and it is risky. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But in the long run, it's much more durable. It's much less exhausting. I know this from my own experience because I'm not spending everything on maintenance of the image, maintenance of the armor. I don't have to tell you the world is full of pain, uncertainty, injustice, and we'd be foolish to try to pretend otherwise. But every loss we encounter in ourselves and others is an opening. And believe me, we'll be handed them several times in the coming days in some form, whether little or big, whether we want them or not. But each time one shows up, we have a choice. We can shut the world out, stand up with dignity, or we can stand up with some dignity and let our hearts respond genuinely. We can meet life as it is rather than as we wish it were. That's the key here. Not as a weakness, but as the only true strength there really is, and that is being open, hearted, and vulnerable. So those are some thoughts this morning on vulnerability.